Labor opposition. I am standing to add my comments to that of Clayton Cosgrove before me, that we are supporting this bill. And if I can talk briefly about the purpose of the bill, or some history, that the bill was actually introduced by Labor in 2005, or was introduced in 2004, but came into effect in 2005. And it regulated the awarding of compensation to prisoners for breaches of their rights. The Act also provided a regime whereby victims of compensated prisoners can claim for damages, payment for which would come out of the prisoner's compensation awarded. Now, when Labor brought the bill forward, it was as a matter of justice, Mr Speaker, so that victims of crime would actually get some redress. Now, we are supporting effectively a rollover or an extension of 2 years of the application of those provisions or of this bill, this Act, so that what the government has said that they will do is that they will be introducing a second prisoners and victims claims amendment bill later this year. So that certainly we see this as really a minor technical change, and anything that is going to improve services and support to victims, Mr Speaker, certainly you will have no opposition, or the government will have no opposition from this side of the House. My friend Chester Burrows, who spoke before, started off very well by commending the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, and I think that was a very sensible thing to do, because the committee is hard-working. But I was very, very disappointed in Chester Burrows in his, and I don't think, Mr Speaker, I did take offence, but I don't think there was any malice intended by Chester Burrows. But to actually stand in this House and talk about how that perhaps through the accident compensation scheme, that compensation for victims of sexual assault was maybe not the appropriate venue. Well, that may not be, Mr Speaker, but that is the system that we have in place. That is the system whereby victims of sexual assault and serious crime receive the counselling they need and deserve. It is the only and currently the appropriate way for those people to get that. Now, Chester Burrows simply did not understand that, but I'm not going to stand in this House and blame Chester Burrows, and do you know why? Because the Minister of ACC doesn't get it either. The Minister of ACC, despite his own advice that he has given, does not understand the reality for victims of sexual assault in New Zealand as it is at the moment. Despite professionals, psychotherapists, counsellors writing to him, survivors of sexual assault writing to him saying this unfortunate experiment that is going on, as Chester Burrows spoke about before me, Mr Speaker, this unfortunate experiment is not providing victims the support that they need and deserve. And that is a very, very serious situation, and I know, Mr Speaker, that the other two speakers before me have certainly made considerable comment on that, and I feel it's appropriate for, given Chester Burrows' statements, that I clarify to the House, Mr Speaker, that that is certainly not the situation. The cutting of the services and support for ACC has been absolutely dreadful, and the human cost, while it has, as was the intention, to save ACC money in terms of providing those counselling services, the cost, the human cost, is absolutely immeasurable. And so I commend Simon Powell. I commend him for some of the work that he is doing for victims' rights. But I would urge the Minister to have a talk to Nick Smith and explain to him, and in fact I would suggest have a caucus session on it, because clearly Chester Burrows, who is a well-meaning member, who has been very committed in terms of the Justice Committee, Chester Burrows clearly doesn't understand, and what I can see is there is clearly a big communication dysfunction within the National Caucus, and perhaps Perhaps if that was cleared, then we wouldn't have the sad situation that we do see for victims and I'm not going to respond to that joke at the moment, because I don't think this is a joking matter. Whilst other members of the House...
Order. The member can't bring the Speaker into the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the challenge that I'm being sarcastic, I am merely speaking the truth. The truth is that from 300 to 400 members a month down to 6 members receiving the support they need and deserve is a travesty. It is an absolute travesty, and that member needs to take note of what is happening and needs to raise it, as indeed I am hoping that Simon Powell, the Minister of Justice, will in his caucus. I want to actually also move on, Mr. Speaker, and talk about some of the other issues that are there for victims in this country. Now, in terms of the Labor government, we passed the Sentencing Act, which went quite a considerable way in terms of victims' rights. When we look at restorative justice, when we look at the Victims' Rights Act in 2002, giving victims the right to information and the ability to have input into sentencing decisions, went a long way in terms of providing more support for victims of crime in our country. And as we know, the Prisoners and Victims Claim of 2005 was the aim was to ensure that victims of inmates were awarded compensation and could claim against the compensation that those inmates were awarded. So I look forward to, as the government has said, bringing further improvements to what is already in place to this House. Also, that if we look at, and I think very importantly, in terms of victims' rights, the introduction in February 2008 of a Victims' Charter, and that was developed so that victims would be aware of the services and the support that was available to them. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge all the good work that many agencies do for victims, Women's Refuge, the victim support throughout New Zealand, and in terms of the 0800 line, that was introduced under the Labor government that gave more support to victims. And then, of course, more funding through family violence courts that was introduced under Labor, and the introduction of an independent victim support advocate person, which is really important to provide that support to victims of domestic violence. And, Mr. Speaker, it was... whilst we've seen some progress, and I do acknowledge that, on victims' rights, it is very sad, as many people have said, women's refuge organisations, that whilst there's been some improvement to victims' rights, that we still have a very good victims' rights bill, domestic violence bill, languishing on the order paper. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because it is a Labor Party bill. And I would ask this House to consider that, to put party politics aside and to look at what is best for victims. And I'd take this opportunity, if I may, Mr. Speaker, to request that the government give very careful consideration into moving that bill forward on the order paper, so that indeed there are real improvements to victims and more support for victims of domestic violence. So, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, there will not be any opposition to this bill from the Labor members of the House. Indeed, if it provides any support or services for victims, it has our support, but I will close in saying that it is a pity that the Minister of ACC does not have in his mind the same principles of support for people who are victims and survivors of serious sexual assault. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.